Hi, I'm Matt Stoller, author of Monopoly-focused Substack newsletter Big and an antitrust policy analyst. I have a great segment for you today on this big breakdown. It's about the first big antitrust trial of the 21st century, which starts next Tuesday against the search giant Google. I want to start with a picture of an octopus. Since 1890, there have been a few big monopolization trials that have shaped the biggest corporations in America. So starting with Standard Oil around the turn of the 20th century. So this is a cartoon of that corporate behemoth. You could see Standard Oil written on the top of the octopus's head. And there's a reason for that. Americans have traditionally symbolized monopoly power as an entity with tentacles reaching out everywhere, hence an octopus. It's actually still a good metaphor today. So Google, which is worth almost $2 trillion in terms of its total value, has a lot of tentacles. It knows more about most of us than our families because it answers intimate questions from billions of people every day. It controls much of our communications to boot. It has 95% market share in search, annual revenue of a little less than $300 billion a year, and 15 products with more than 500 million users apiece. We've perhaps never seen any corporate asset as powerful as Google Search. Marketing professor Scott Galloway in 2017, he went so far as to say that, quote, Google is God. Okay, so why is Google on trial? And what does this trial signify? Well, Google is on trial for violating antitrust law, which means, in short, that it has an illegal monopoly. The government argues that Google controls roughly 90 to 95% of general search and search advertising, and that it has used this remarkable market share, monopoly share, using illegal tactics to keep rivals out of the market unfairly. Now, Google, of course, disagrees, but we'll get to the details of the case in a bit. But let's ask a different question. So does this case really matter? Let's put it in context. Don't powerful corporations always win? Doesn't big money always carry the day in America? In fact, no. Historically, anti-monopoly has been the pro-business tradition in America, ensuring equality in the marketplace. And to understand what that means, it helps to look at previous antitrust cases involving the biggest corporations in the world at the time that they were held. So there have been a few big ones that are as historically important as the Google case. So there was Standard Oil in the 1890s, Alcoa in the 1940s, IBM in the 1970s, AT&T in the 1980s, Microsoft in the 1990s. And these cases are almost always against high-tech firms that control a key sector in the economy. So oil in the 1890s, telecommunications in the 1980s, operating systems and office productivity software in the 1990s. Win or lose, they determine what our society looks like going forward. Now, most people think technological progress is due to scientists and engineers figuring stuff out and innovating. And it's sort of true, but it's also due to law. Want to know why we even have the internet? Well, one reason, and an important one, is that in 1982, a judge named Harold Green ruled to break up AT&T, which had historically tried to control its network tightly and probably would have tried to block things like dial-up modems from being attached to its network. It certainly did block a lot of stuff prior to the 1960s. So you can see a memorial to the AT&T case when you walk into the DC court building, which is the same one where a judge named Amit Mehta is hearing the Google trial. So you can see it. There's a cartoon on display as a man in a robe tangled up in phone cords. That's a cartoon of Harold Green. He was an extraordinary man. So he was born in Germany in 1923, fled the Nazis, enlisted in the U.S. Army during World War II, and then went to night school after the war. He ended up at the Justice Department, where he helped draft the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. And in 1978, Jimmy Carter put him on the court as a district judge. That's where he heard the AT&T case. Now, so Green was no fool, and he was no fan of corporate power. He ruled against AT&T and sought to fulfill the goal of, quote, deconcentrating AT&T's vast economic power. The guy had been up close with the Nazis. He was not intimidated by a large corporation. And the thing about it is at the time, there were a lot of people said, oh, this is terrible for the country. It's going to hurt this great corporation that everybody loves, very innovative, Bell Labs. But in truth, the breakup really delivered. Telephone rates came down for consumers, but far more importantly, there was a massive explosion of innovation, including, in all likelihood, the development of the internet and mobile telephony. The judge in the Google case is named Judge Mehta. He's pictured here. Let's take a look. Now, Mehta is now in the same position as Judge Green, able to shape a future to all of us or just to Google. But in contrast to Green, Mehta's career tracks very much like most of our technocratic elites. Now, he's an immigrant, but he grew up in a suburb of Maryland, worked at the big law firm Latham and Watkins for a few years of training. And then he was a public defender in D.C., and then he served as a white-collar defense attorney. Mehta doesn't, as far as I can tell, have a strong record of recognizing the threat of concentrated corporate power or an instinctive skepticism of the powerful. And we can already see some problematic choices from Mehta. And I'm going to focus on Mehta. I'm going to do a few segments on the Google case. I'm going to focus on Mehta because judges really go unexamined in our culture, and it's important to change that. They are political actors. So Google executives, including its CEO Sundar Pichai, have been found in multiple cases, including this one, of destroying evidence related to potential antitrust violations, essentially deleting chat logs. So chat logs involving discussion over antitrust show that, quote, Pichai personally asked whether a chat group's history could be turned off and then attempted to delete that message, end quote. And that is a big no-no. Okay, you are not supposed to destroy chat logs and antitrust-related or monopoly-related evidence. You just don't do that. That's illegal. And in California, a judge actually sanctioned Google for this behavior. They levied penalties on Google and its lawyers. But so far, Judge Mehta has not. Now, I don't want to overstate the problem. The judge has ruled reasonably well in an earlier merger case. He might do something about the document destruction, but that's who he is. So that's the judge. Let's go a little more into the case, which is all about something called defaults, right? That's how Google controls its market power. At least that's what the government argues. The government says that Google's monopoly in search is illegal, and it has maintained this monopoly not by making a better product. If you notice, there's a lot more ads in Google search today, but by locking down everywhere that consumers might be able to find a different search engine option and making sure that they only see Google instead. So here's a slide that the Department of Justice included in its complaint in 2020. So it is the default search engine, Google, whenever you open your phone or whenever you open most browsers. As a result, when you use Google, you are giving Google some data, which it can use to improve its search engines and which more importantly, its competitors cannot. Now, the basic claim is that Google has essentially bought up all the shelf space where people might find a different search engine. It pays $45 billion a year to have distributors refuse to carry its competitors' products, signing deals with Apple, Motorola, Samsung, major US wireless carriers like AT&T, T-Mobile, Verizon, browser developers like Mozilla, Opera, UC Web to secure default status for its general search engine, and in many cases, to specifically prohibit Google's counterparties from dealing with Google's competitors. So that's the case. And the big partner here for Google is Apple, which receives something like $10 to $15 billion a year for placing Google as the default search engine on the iPhone and the Mac. And this revenue is really important to Apple. It's basically Apple and Google sharing monopoly profits. Apple's fantastically profitable, but still, $15 billion is a lot of money, and that's just in the US. Now, here's a story that came out in the Financial Times in 2020 when the Apple case was filed. Apple is, in fact, preparing its own search engine in case its deal with Google falls apart due to this case. In other words, if the government succeeds, we'll have more search engines and competition in this market because at least Apple will enter. Now, it should be a slam dunk case, and not just because Google search has become much worse over the last 5 to 10 years, packed increasingly with ads and poor results. To understand why this case makes sense, look no further than the experience of Neva, a search engine whose quality was as high or higher than that of Google, but died a few months ago because it just couldn't get access to customers. Neva, according to David Pierce in The Verge, was running an AI product, so that's the most innovative for artificial intelligence, a full stack search engine, and a privacy-first browser. If people went through all the bother of switching, they became converts, Pierce wrote. The problem was that very few of them managed to make it past the thicket of default settings and redirections. Now, I actually used Neva, and it was a good search engine. But as all defaults are set to Google, there are an endless number of screens encouraging people to set their search engine to that of the search giant. So Neva, despite its quality, despite its differentiated lack of ads, could not get in front of potential customers, and it died. These default settings and redirections are what's on trial because that's what killed Neva, and that's what prevents anyone else from investing in the next search competitor. If Google is found guilty and disciplined reasonably by being broken apart or having a choice screen imposed or some other set of remedies, then the new technologies of machine learning, AI, will actually be deployed in a competitive marketplace. That's new rival search engines can try different things, and we'll see immense possibilities open up, similar to those after the AT&T breakup. The future of telecommunications was not obvious in 1982 when that breakup happened. It only happened because of the breakup. There's actually a good amount of evidence on that as well. And that's true historically with all of these old antitrust cases. Okay, so far I've laid out the arguments in the case and the historical context. But what about Google? What do they say about the allegations? Google has a case. Google's essential argument is that search is about economies of scale and that it owns the whole market, not because it's a predator, but because consumers simply prefer its search engines to rivals. Let's go back to the Department of Justice slide on defaults, because this argument works both ways. Now, Google would say that it might engage in behavior to exclude competitors, but it needs to do so to get the data to improve its search engine. Fundamentally, Google argues, its ability to exclude others is a good deal for America. The exclusion is the price of this great search engine. In other words, consumers love Google. They love this search just so much that its monopoly is legal. That's Google's argument. Now, my view is that Google search is not as good as it used to be. It's not as good as it would be if it were disciplined by competition. Google is coasting, essentially. It produces an increasingly shoddy product. There's an economist in the 60s who said a great line. She said, the best reward for a monopolist is a quiet life. That's what Google is at this point. So as one Googler who left the company recently put it, quote, Google has 175,000 plus capable and well-compensated employees who get very little done, end quote. Google used to be magic, but that was 10 years ago. Today, search is full of too many ads, crap results peddled with because of Google's own self-interest. So here is what the Washington Post noted in 2020. The Internet Archive's Wayback Machine stored some Google search results over the years. When we look back, a picture emerges of how Google increasingly fails us. There's more space dedicated to ads that look like search results. More results start with answer snippets, sometimes incorrect, ripped from other sites. And increasingly, results point you back to Google's own properties, such as Maps and YouTube, where it can show more ads and gather more of your data. Many judges believe what executives say. And so Judge Mehta is likely to hear from Google's CEO that economies of scale are all that drives product quality. And he may buy that. The judge may believe that. And I actually think Google executives believe it as well. Still, such an argument isn't really any different from what every monopolist has always argued. Standard Oil discussed how it brought cheap kerosene to the masses. AT&T stressed its awesome quality and universal service. Alcoa said that its control over aluminum was a result of its focus and dedication to America. IBM talked about how much it innovated and developed the computing industry. Monopolists always believe they are serving humanity. But Congress made it clear by passing antitrust laws that monopolies, whatever they may say or think, are not actually doing that. And the evidence, from Standard Oil's breakup leading to the development of gasoline, to the lawsuit, the antitrust lawsuit in the 60s against IBM, creating the modern software industry, suggests that Congress was right. Depending on what happens, there may be additional time spent on a remedy, or the case may go on appeal. Indeed, Judge Mehta is not the only person who matters here. He does decide whether Google is guilty initially, he decides the remedy initially, but the case is likely to be appealed, probably all the way to the Supreme Court. And if the Supreme Court, Judge Mehta, the DC Circuit, the Supreme Court, erodes antitrust case law against Google, so much that this giant search monopoly, that's obviously a monopoly, everyone knows it's a monopoly. If they say, well, this is not, the monopolization laws don't apply to this monopoly, even though it's giant, controls all this information, controls society in many ways, then Congress will be confronted with the reality that it is hard to use the existing antitrust laws to address dominant corporate power, which is what they were written originally to address. As witnesses testify, from Google executives to rivals, we're about to learn an enormous amount about how the internet developed, how advertising is sold, and why decisions about what we search for happen the way that they do. It's pretty disconcerting that so much key evidence was destroyed by Google and the judge hasn't done anything yet. But this case will still be a massively educational experience for the public, for the industry, and for Congress. Indeed, a tidbit that came out on a hearing last Friday is that Google is actually opposing having a public feed in the courtroom, whereas the government actually does want a public feed. Apparently, the search giant doesn't want the public to be able to hear the arguments and evidence at hand. I guess that sometimes Google is concerned about privacy. Well, the thing is that if I were Google executive and I wanted to maintain Google's monopoly, I wouldn't want this information to come out either. I mean, I would want the public to know as little as possible about my business. But that is in many ways what these antitrust cases are for, to learn about how our markets work, to learn about whether firms are using coercive market power or whether they are competing on the merits. Whatever happens, reviving laws to constrain corporate power does take time, as people within many institutions have to change their mind and come to grips with the choice of living in a free society or one that is dominated by monopolies and is much more authoritarian in its commercial structure. Fortunately, that change is happening. In September and October, so that is this month, starting on Tuesday, we're going to start to see some of the fruits of that change. And hopefully, Judge Mehta will live up to the legacy of the DC District Court set 41 years ago by the courage of one Judge Harold Green. Thanks for watching this big breakdown on the Breaking Points channel. If you'd like to know more about big business and how our economy really works, you can sign up by going to the link in the description below for my market power focused newsletter, Big. Thanks, and have a good one.
Hey guys, if you like that video, go to breakingpoints.com, become a premium subscriber, and help us build the best independent media organization on the planet.
That's right. We're subscriber funded. We're building something new. We want to replace these failing mainstream media organizations.
So again, to subscribe, it's breakingpoints.com.